Good afternoon from the German House in New York City. I am Eva Bosbach, Executive Director of the North America Office of the University of Cologne, and I have the pleasure to welcome you all to our 10th Transatlantic Tandem Talk, today on the topic of election campaign financing in the US and Germany. Mark Twain once said about America, quote, "We have the best government that money can buy," quote end. Do we get the best president that money can buy? Some of you might have watched the US presidential debate 2 days ago, and probably many of you are following the elections development here in the US with already a lot of events covering this topic. So we tried to pick a topic that has not been covered extensively yet, and at the same time, one that we think is actually essential to the election campaigning process and ultimately possibly even to the election result. So that is how we decided on election campaign financing. And I am delighted that we can present it to you as a conversation between Sandra Navidi, CEO of the New York-based advisory firm Beyond Global, attorney on both sides of the Atlantic, and also a University of Cologne alumna and best-selling author of, among others, the book Die DNA der USA, nominated for the German Business Book Award by the Frankfurt Book Fair. And Maureen Edebor, Assistant Professor of Law at the Washington and Lee School of Law and Fellow in Constitutional Law and History at the NYU School of Law, where she teaches and writes about voting and elections. We are also honored to have Jena Kwon with us as a moderator, a journalist for ZDF and WDR, covering transatlantic relations, including the presidential debate and elections this year, fellow at Harvard University, and another University of Cologne alumna. So while you probably here today because the topic sparked your interest and we did receive over 300 registrations for today, I would also like to invite you to check out the University of Cologne in Germany for a potential partnership for you or your institution for study or research, because as you see, we clearly produce alumni with successful careers. Now, before I hand it over to the next speaker, I just want to thank all our dear partners in this Transatlantic Tandem Talk series, the German Center for Research and Innovation, DWIH New York, the German Consulate General New York, the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD New York, Deutsches Haus at NYU, Goethe Institute New York, 1014 Space for Ideas, the German Research Foundation, DFG North America, the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, America House NRW, and new as of this year, the American Council on Germany, ACG. This event is part of the NRW USA year that ends this month, and we were happy to participate with a number of events and activities in celebrating this important transatlantic partnership. So thank you all for being with us today, and over to Victoria Habecke, Director of America House NRW.
Thank you, dear Eva, and thank you to all the partners in this big coalition. It's a pleasure to work with you. To all our guests online, good evening from Cologne. My name is Victoria Habecke. I'm the director of the America House NRW, a nonprofit organization that fosters transatlantic exchange and understanding. There is great interest in the US elections here, and when we follow the news, we often hear these staggering numbers. Kamala Harris raised $200 million just in the first week after she replaced Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket. The 2020 elections in the US, presidential and congressional combined, cost around $14 billion. So we felt it would be really valuable to look behind these figures at the rules and structures that make them possible. Also to contrast the American way of campaign financing with the German system, and to understand which influence so much money has on election outcomes. We have an excellent panel to dive into these questions. Sandra Navidi, Maureen Edebor, Jena Kwon, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. I am very much looking forward to the discussion, and I hand over to you, Jena.
Thank you so much, Eva and Victoria, for the kind introduction and for a very good foundation for our discussion today. My name is Jena Kwon. I'm the moderator of this truly fascinating discussion, and I'm honored to be back with the University of Cologne, New York office. I've had some really exciting panel discussions with you in the past and happy to work with the America House, with all of the partners, and of course, our speakers. Okay, before we dive in, I just want to announce that we will have a Q&A session, and I do want to encourage all of you to ask anything related to the topic in the Q&A box. Be as brief and concise as possible, as we will read it out loud. And if you want, please write down the name of the speaker you want to raise the question to. If not, leave it just open. Okay, let's start. Money is a term that we will hear a lot over the next hour because money plays a huge role when it comes to presidential elections in the US. And it seems to get more and more important, especially in the election campaign we're currently in. So Sandra, here's my very first question to you. Asking people for money, for donations, to the candidates is a pretty normal thing in the US. And for Germans, it sometimes seems a little bit too direct, and also hard to imagine that anything similar could happen here in Germany. How would you describe the growing influence of funding in US election campaigns?
Well, I would say that the US has many aspects that are magnificent and example for the rest of the world, but campaign finance law is not one of them. And as Eva said, a series of Supreme Court decisions especially have led to the fact that the US now has the best democracy that money can buy. And let me give you an example. Elon Musk has committed to giving $45 million a month to Donald Trump. He's later denied it, but apparently he's giving it through a so-called super PAC, which is kind of like a fund. We'll probably get to that later. Donald Trump has in turn announced that he would hire Elon Musk as an advisor. Now, Elon Musk has several companies, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, Twitter, now X, that are regulated by the government. Another example is J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate. He's financed by another Silicon Valley billionaire, Peter Thiel. He is the owner of Palantir. Both Musk and Thiel get government jobs. They get subsidies. They are regulated. So basically, these people who are being regulated by the government are allowed to buy into the government and exert direct influence. And on a side note, most of these billionaires have very extreme ideologies, and 70% of donations for campaigns come from 1% of people. And this 1%, like these billionaires, first of all, they have very special interests, and many people who make it to the top are very idiosyncratic and particular. And so their interests don't reflect the interest of the people. So they pick more extreme candidates than most of the voters would choose, but those become the candidates. And so then it becomes a feedback loop where more and more extreme candidates are nominated, and the whole political discourse becomes more polarized. So the voters, the Republican voters on balance are not as extreme as those candidates, which are funded by those extreme, mostly billionaires. How did we get here? That's a whole story, and probably Maureen will get to it in more detail, but there was a landmark decision in 2010. It's called Citizens United, which basically gave corporations the same right to express their political opinions as natural persons, and basically allowed for unlimited spending. But if you look at it, it's not just this decision. There were a number of other decisions previous to that. And if you take a step back and look at the big picture and connect the dots, you will see over the last decades a concerted effort to influence the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, and for special interests, very rich people and corporations to influence the political landscape of the United States.
Thank you, Sandra. We will go a little bit deeper with that in a few minutes. But let me first ask you, Maureen, you are American and you are very familiar with the system that Sandra just described. But you also know the German system quite well. What are the key differences, you would say, between the two countries when it comes to election campaign financing? And do you also have any information about how much the two candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, have already raised by now?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. So, with respect to the difference between the two countries, Germany and the United States, in campaign finance, I would like to highlight, I think, two pretty significant differences. The first is the public funding scheme. In Germany, as you all know so well, the parties receive funds in proportion to the latest election results. And they distribute those funds in pursuit of the campaign and the election. They're also not very strict, but also not very loose disclosure requirements that really protect the privacy of some individuals who might not want to be publicly identified based on the amount of money they have donated. So I think it creates a more equitable system in which legislators don't have to worry about fundraising and campaigning, and they can worry about doing their job, sort of creating more, I think, egalitarian and well incentivized legislation for the public good. In the United States, on the other hand, we do have a system of public financing. But what's fascinating is that no presidential candidate or campaign has taken advantage of that system since, I believe, 2004 or the next presidential election. And the reason why is because there are so many perverse incentives to go the private corporate funding route. Some of those Sandra highlighted earlier on, but a few are the influence of corporations in our political elections, in the sense that the Supreme Court has essentially allowed corporations to express their speech through funds, which are really sort of funneled through 501c4 organizations, which we'll talk about throughout our presentation. I won't belabor the point, but these organizations can accept unlimited corporate donations, and they're often funneled to super PACs, which don't have the same disclosure or don't have minimal disclosure requirements. So it's kind of creating a muddy water of who is really speaking to which policy positions and what corporations have a vested interest in which candidate and why. And that makes not only running for office really expensive, it also makes, I think, our legislature a little more difficult to function because legislators are so concerned with raising money to survive the next election. A second, I think, difference is in advertising. In Germany, for political campaigns, you all are only allowed to advertise in the short period before the election. And there are limited spots, I believe, on radio and television that are allotted in the months preceding the election for that campaign speech. In the United States, I mean, candidates start campaigning once they're organizationally ready to, once they file their paperwork, and that can be 2 years before the election. And if you donate to, these politicians, you'll be bombarded with texts, emails. They'll share your email with similar candidates. So there are less restrictions around advertising, which I also think is a fascinating difference between the two countries.
Thank you. Just a very quick follow-up question, Maureen. What exactly are super PACs for all the people out there who haven't heard of that before?
Yeah, great question. So super PACs are independent expenditure only committees, which can spend an unlimited amount of money on an election or a particular policy issue, and they don't have to reveal their donors. And in turn, the organizations that donate to those super PACs have similar lack of disclosure requirements, which makes it really confusing for voters to determine who is speaking to them when they see a campaign ad. And what the other incentives are behind campaigning in a particular way. It makes it hard to understand the full scope of issues. So that's the definition of a super PAC, and I think some dark implications of a super PAC as well.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Sandra, you've already mentioned Citizens United in your very first answer. We need to talk about that when it comes to US campaign financing. Can you quickly explain to the people who haven't heard of that, what exactly is Citizens United and what were the driving forces behind it?
Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision from 2010. And I think especially for legal lay people, the most important thing to understand in simplified terms is that corporations are treated as just like people. Like they should have the same rights as human beings should, especially when it comes to free political speech. And then also, which is kind of grotesque because a corporation is a legal fiction. It's a fiction that has been created to serve a specific purpose. It's not supposed to have, I mean, if you think about it reasonably, rights like people do. And the second aspect that's important is that basically money is speech. Money is free speech. And if you equate these two things, you create an unholy alliance. And basically, Citizens United, this decision rubber stamped, legalized corruption. And to just quickly circle back to the super PACs, what's also important to keep in mind, because that is a issue that also exists in Germany, though not quite to the same extent, and that is the influence of foreign powers. So one important criterion in campaign finance is transparency. And Germany is doing a reasonably good job on that front with regard to disclosure requirements, although there is room for improvement there too. It's not a perfect system by a long shot. In the US, it's sub-ideal, and especially those super PACs, which have very lax disclosure requirements, and they can be easily circumvented. So you create charitable organizations or whatever, and kind of make this whole process opaque. So in the end, you can't really see where the money comes from. Did it come from China? Has it come from Russian sources? And in this age of polarization, this is a very important point. On a side note, there have also been scandals with regard to the AfD, of receiving money from Russia, although I don't know exactly what came. This is the problem with it. This never seems to go anywhere exactly, because I think that money came via Switzerland. But for instance, Sarah Wagenknecht got, I believe, $4 million from one donor alone. I don't know exactly who that is, but it's important to point out this is a brand new party. It only has 650 members as of last month, 650 people who are members. And she already gets outsized donations in Germany from one individual donor. And there were a couple of others. So you see where the issue is. This is a problem everywhere where money is like the root of all evil in politics.
That's true. Maureen, we've already mentioned that people have the impression the influence, the impact of money and funding in the US is increasingly growing. How exactly did the campaign finance system in the US change such that corporations have an outside influence in determining presidential elections and presidential candidates as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with kind of the overarching principles of any campaign finance regulation system, which specific to the United States, but I think largely across all democracies, we want to diversify who can run for office, make sure that the normal person who represents, 99% of the country can actually run for office, representative candidates, curb corruption of candidates who might want to enrich themselves by running for office, but also determine what special interests are behind certain policies to better educate yourself about a particular predicament your country is facing. So I think starting in perhaps the 80s, the 90s, there became a sentiment in United States politics, which created further division among, I think, social policy lines. And many people sought to capitalize on that through spending money to influence elections and get their policies across. And someone named Senator John McCain, who ran for president in 2008, I believe, championed legislation called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And as the title notes, it was bipartisan, and it was really successful in sort of forcing interest groups and political parties to essentially stand by their ads and say, I am Donald Trump and I approve this message, or I am Kamala Harris and I approve this message because my campaign officially paid for it, and it's important for voters to know that. So because of the increasing social conflict in United States politics, the desire for the people with bigger pockets to influence policy became even more strong. And I think that's what led, I think, on a philosophical level, the Supreme Court to say that corporations, as Sandra noted, are people. They have First Amendment rights, and money is speech, and speech is protected in the United States. It's the first article of the Bill of Rights. So any restriction on the political speech of a corporation is just unconstitutional, really opening the floodgates to corporate money for American elections. So now you can sort of trace empirically the line between that Supreme Court decision and the amount of money that's spent in United States elections, such that now, as we discussed in our opening, the cost of running an election is astronomically high. Kamala Harris has raised about $531 million. Donald Trump, a little less than that, but that's an astronomical number, even comparing it to 1990. So now we have a system in which 501c4 corporations can take money from corporations in an unlimited amount, and they can then donate to a PAC, a super PAC, which is a group of people who raise and spend money to elect or defeat a candidate through advertising. And those super PACs do not have robust disclosure requirements such that you can really muddy the water between an individual corporation, a nonprofit, and then a political action committee that doesn't have to disclose, the money trail. So I think that's sort of how we got to this crazy position where to run for president of the United States, you need upwards of $1 billion, such that it's clear that there's a pay-to-play system to an extent, even though with respect to Kamala Harris, I think 231 million of her donations came from small donors. That's not really normal in campaigns anymore, because the normal person doesn't feel like they have a voice due to the Supreme Court's decision and the prevalence of super PACs.
The Supreme Court.
Sorry,
yeah, sure.
I always asked, specifically in Germany, how is it possible that a country of 330 million people, there are only a handful of potential candidates? And the reason is money in politics. This is why we have dynasties, political dynasties, like the Bushes, the Clintons, to some extent, even Kennedys are still around, Obama's. Michelle probably could have run if she had wanted to, because she has the networks and the money. And eventually everybody gets corrupted, because Maureen mentioned grassroots efforts with regard to Kamala Harris. We saw the same phenomenon, I think, first with Barack Obama, but then he got into the same maelstrom. You just can't free yourself. There are certain dynamics and forces that capture you. And in the end, he had to raise the same kind of money from similar sources. And that led to the notion with the voters that he was also in the end captured.
Thank you, Sandra. You just mentioned a word that kind of rings a bell in my ear, which is corruption. We're talking about immense sums of money when it comes to election financing. To what extent do you have the impression that people are questioning the transparency of the whole routes and the sources of the money? Maybe this is a question to you, Sandra, but also to you, Maureen. What is the situation in the US and in Germany?
Well, the reason why we're seeing this polarization and this hatred is because people don't trust the system, the establishment, and each other. We can't agree on a common truth because truth has been corrupted, for instance, science by academics who did studies for the oil industry or the pharma industry. So the whole system, it seems like almost everybody in the system is corrupted. But what is the worst, since today the legal system is in focus, the law is supposed to control corruption. But we're now at a stage where we see that the law has been corrupted. And that I have to circle back to where, to what I spoke to in my first response, where you see that over the last decades, there's, for instance, I have to say, most big money organizations who try to deregulate and get rid of the last protections that we still have are the Republicans. And they have organizations that work very consistently and focused on this purpose. And there is an organization called the Federalist Society, which for decades has cultivated lawyers. They went to campuses of universities. They connected with the most important most gifted law students, and basically got them into the legal system, into the judiciary. And that is the reason why eventually they succeeded in capturing the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is now majority Republican. They just decided that in the case of Donald Trump, that a president essentially has no limits on his power. Anything he does in an official capacity is legal, and you can always kind of fabricate an argument that everything he does is kind of has an official nexus. So I think the issue is that this system is so corrupted. To kind of get back to a more reasonable state seems kind of hopeless at this point. I don't know how Maureen sees it. She works more in this field directly.
Yeah, that was great insight, Sandra. I mean, I feel similarly. And I think what really demonstrates the connection between corruption and lax campaign finance and corporations overflowing our campaigns with money is, you know, when you're a person working in a legislature and you have 2 years there and you want more, which, you know, the system incentivizes us to want more. It's a job that pays great money and benefits. You want to stay there. So what are you going to do? You're going to meet with the people who have given you money. And if you have a choice between Exxon, a major oil corporation who gave you, you know, the maximum amount they could give you, and constituents who are worried about, you know, an issue that might not affect most of your district, but is still important, you're incentivized to take the meeting with the corporation because, in a sense, you owe them. They want to influence your actions, and in turn, you want to keep them in good favor to keep the campaign funds going. And that is the corruption. It's not necessarily so blatant. And sure, some of those meetings could really be not about a quid pro quo or an exchange of money for policy and things like that, but largely our system, we've been discussing, incentivizes both corporations and legislators to engage in a pay for play in pursuit of, I think, personal gratitude and also just a willingness to keep a job.
Thank you. I have some, yeah, Sandra, go on.
In essence, when you, and I did a lot of research for my books on this, what we're looking at the law and at provisions and rules and regulations, but to what Maureen said, in the end, even the law is a very human business. And in the end, it comes down to human connections and favors and networks. And so checks and balances, which are always invoked with regard to a potential Trump presidency, checks and balances are only as good as the people who are behind them, who execute them. They're not fail-safe mechanisms. And you see that in the end, it comes down to human nature. And when the whole system has been corrupted, it becomes difficult to reform it.
Speaking of law and the legal dimension of election financing, what are the legal implications of US campaign finance laws in comparison to Germany? Maybe we can compare those two systems as well at this point.
Well, maybe I can start with saying that it's a completely different system. And one of the main differences, apart from historic differences, are that in the US, you essentially have a two-party system. That's a huge difference. In Germany, we have a whole plethora of parties, new parties, upcoming parties. The AfD isn't very old. Sarah Wagenknecht, okay, she's an individual who was well known, but her party basically became super successful overnight. And so we have this more equitable system, which is a combination of private and public sources. And the argument is we don't want it to be entirely privately funded because then politicians become beholden to the donors. We don't want it to be entirely publicly funded either, because then parties become nothing more than government entities. And also parties are supposed to be like the glue between the people and the government, the state. And so that's why we want a mix. And the technical details are elaborate, as they always are in Germany, although not overly so. So I think it's a fairly fair system. But as I said, there's room for improvements, because as I understand it, there are no limits to donations. You just have to publicize them, and only the biggest ones you have to immediately publicize. I believe below $10,000 you have to report on them, but that can take a couple of years. So, but this system is not free from the risk of influence, and especially one of my biggest worries is foreign influence. Maureen, do you want to take it up from here?
Yeah, maybe you can add to that point and also speak a little bit more about how the US regulates campaign finance and federal elections, what infrastructure or administrative oversight is in place to make sure this law is actually followed. Maybe you can kind of combine the two aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the drawback of the German public financing system from maybe an American perspective is the overwhelming role that the political party in America plays in public life, basically. It's, I think, hard to imagine American politicians being content with a system where the individual politician is reduced to the role of a cog in the wheel, essentially, and they don't get to exercise, I guess, the influence that they might want to over how they raise and spend money. I think that's just a structural system that really differentiates two countries and also makes public financing the way Germany administers it hard to imagine in the United States. But as for the administrative oversight of the various campaign finance laws we have and, compliance with Supreme Court decisions, we have the Federal Election Committee. They are a federal agency run by the government, which was the first federal agency to oversee campaign finance since, I believe, 2011. Or excuse me, 2011 is when they had their first oversight hearing, which indicated that Congress, in a sense, was starting to take campaign finance oversight a little more seriously. But something that stopped good oversight is the partisan gridlock. Over the last decade and a half, really sharp partisan divisions among the commissioners has left the agency pretty paralyzed, unable to issue new regulations, provide advisory opinions to political actors who are trying to understand the law. It takes 4 votes out of 6 commissioners to take official action, and the commission requires 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So bipartisanship is required to take action. And in our political climate, it's just been impossible, which has really bottlenecked the agency. But recently, the commission did sort of buck the trend in the sense that they did progress on a really important issue, which is enacting rule changes for improving transparency in online political ads now that more people are getting their news from TikTok and Twitter or X and other online platforms. So they're progressing, but this was a really rare victory. And I don't think many people perceive there will be many more.
Maybe a follow-up question to that, Maureen. Do you see any way that the US can reform its system so that it's more democratic? And would it be more democratic in Germany in your eyes?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the United States can reform its policy to be more democratic and move towards, I think, a more pure German system, if we're talking about a spectrum, by just requiring greater transparency from campaigns on who their donors are, particularly corporate donors and large donors. I think reversing the Citizens United decision such that corporations don't have such a influence on our elections, mandating a public funding system, and maybe allowing political candidates to also take private funds up to an extent, in the general election to incentivize legislators or candidates to use the system, close all of the anonymity loopholes that exist in regulations law and Supreme Court case law. I think all those things are possible, but I'm not sure that I could see them happening in the next 10 years.
I was just going to ask, how realistic is it at the end of the day? Probably not.
Well, we're talking about direct money in politics, which, I mean, that's probably still the easiest to regulate. But then you have all this other money in politics, again, coming mostly, I don't want to say mostly, it comes from both sides, but from the Republican side, it's very streamlined towards a specific purpose. Leonard Leo, the head of the Federalist Society that I mentioned earlier, now spearheads an effort to buy local media and do an influence campaign through social media. We just have the scandal where that's foreign influence, where Russia paid influencers here in the US, conservative influencers who are outrageous, $100,000, I believe, per video, to put out nonsense. Like, for instance, that didn't come from them, but in the vein of, immigrants eat your pets, that kind of stuff. So I think this indirect influencing is almost impossible to regulate. And that is much worse still here than it is in Germany. And also, I think in Germany, politicians still adhere more to norms, conventional norms. And if they're violated, that still would be more of a scandal. Here, people are completely jaded. Like, Donald Trump can say and do what he wants. It's not even a shocker. It's a headline for a split second, and then until the next thing comes around. So I think that's another issue. It's not just the laws. It's also the norms that are being violated, because you can't regulate every human interaction, every little potential scenario. People have to agree, have to have a common consensus on norms. And if that goes, and I feel that's gone here completely, that's very demoralizing.
Thank you, Sandra. We are going to enter the Q&A session soon. I have one more question, but at this point, I just want to remind you all that you can still write down your question in the Q&A box if you haven't already. Thank you. But before that, I have one last question to both of you, Sandra and Maureen. Since yesterday, we know that Team Kamala Harris has a pretty popular supporter, and her name is Taylor Swift. The question is, the question to what extent she will have an impact on the US elections have already dominated the news for months. But what do you think changes now? To what extent is Taylor Swift openly endorsing Kamala Harris also having an impact on the campaign financing?
Can I say, because I wrote my first book about networks, and one of the inspirations was what I saw with regard to Barack Obama and his campaign, how Wall Streeters supported him in the beginning when he was not well known, he was not a household name. And the thing was, the important feature was not that they were, or not only that they were open their wallets to him, but that they opened their networks to him, because that feeds on itself, and that becomes like, over proportionally kind of opens up new networks. And I think that's the most important thing that Taylor Swift did. She did not tell people what to vote for. She just told people who may not be interested in voting or politically interested, she told them, register to vote. And basically, she used her network power.
Maureen?
I couldn't agree more, Sandra. I mean, regardless of your personal feelings towards her music, I think that, you know, Taylor Swift, her and her fans are basically an entire economy. You know, her ticket sales are millions, and many people attend her shows. So her endorsement or, you know, her association with the Harris campaign, I think carries a financial benefit for potentially both campaigns in either galvanizing people one way or the other to you know, act as their favorite pop star wanted them to. It carries a huge amount of influence. And I think it's actually good, and it's more democratic to hear from individual voices rather than corporations.
Thank you so much. And with that, let's start the Q&A session. I can see we have already some questions, but you can still write them down if you want. We will start off with a question by, oh, this one disappeared that I had. Okay. William Donahue is asking, I still don't have a firm understanding of the German system of campaign financing. I understand that it is a mix of public and private, and that is more open than in the US, but more details, please, from the University of Notre Dame in France. So, okay. Yeah, both of you can answer. Please raise your hand.
Let me think if I get all the details together. So basically, for every vote that a German party gets, they get a certain amount of money. Last I knew it was like 87 cents. And the first 4 million votes that they get, I think they get €6 or something like that. So it's kind of staggered. And they get money in relation, they get money from the state in relation to the votes that they get up to a certain amount. I want to say something like, I forget, 200 million. Somebody needs to fact check that. So that's the public part. And then there's the private part where donations up to $500 don't have to be reported. Up to $10,000, they have to be reported, but usually they are with a long delay. So that's a question, how democratic is that if only a couple of years later, you learn that a billionaire, whoever, a group of people donated larger amounts, but then after $10,000, it needs to be reported immediately. And then there are also provisions that try to counteract the fact, you know, circumvention by basically, I don't know the word, like putting smaller amounts by several people, like let's get together, you donate 1,000 and you, and then in order to circumvent the maximum limit of an individual person. Mm-hmm. For starters, Maureen?
Yeah, I think Sandra covered it. I have nothing to add there.
Right. We have some more questions, so let's move on to the next one. Edward Evans has raised the question, can public people and companies offset any donations against their tax bill? Maybe Maureen, you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. In the United States, at least, you know, when you donate to a nonprofit, which is a 501c3, 501c3s don't necessarily engage in electioneering, but they usually have 501c4s that do. So when you donate to one of those groups that does spend money in politics, in a sense, you're getting a tax credit, perhaps, by, you know, donating to nonprofit organizations. So maybe not directly, but to some extent indirectly.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hans-Peter Hacker is asking, where does all the money go to, for example, grassroots supporter?
Oh, I love this question because in the United States, I'm sure everyone has heard of George Santos, who raised a number of campaign funds and misused them on things not relevant to his campaign. So what do politicians, campaigners spend your money on in the US? Advertising, disclaimers, campaign fundraisers, the facilities, fundraising notices, infrastructure for their day-to-day operations, an office building for employees, recounts, which I thought was interesting, transfers between a candidate's different committees, travel for the candidate and, you know, the people associated with the candidate. So it's really a wide variety of things, staff salaries, I mean, almost anything, meals. they can spend your donations any way they want, essentially, so long as it's tangentially connected to the campaign in the United States.
Perhaps for Germans, it's important to keep in mind that this is a huge country and that politicians need to open up offices or headquarters in every single state. And the numbers that I've seen, I seem to recall that the largest part of expenditure goes to communications, to advertisements.
Carol Brown is asking, how do we educate voters how they impact the outcome of the election, the local level? Or can you speak more of the impact of financial contributions that can have a greater impact regionally or statewide? Yes, this is Carol Brown's question.
I think it's very important to realize, and that's also part of my mission, that we feel overwhelmed by these developments and feel like we're kind of helpless, but we're all nodes in these networks, and we need to congregate and we need to educate ourselves. And we have to understand not everybody who has like a full-time job in a different industry and maybe is a single mom who needs to, feed her kids. People have limited bandwidth, but I feel community effort is so utterly important because also we're a little bit in a bread and circus culture where people, I feel sometimes or it's attempted to dumb them down with media. I talk about the Kardashianization of culture in my book. And so I think what I said before, people network, human to human contact is super important, to talk to your neighbors and talk to people who may have a different opinion from yours, because every vote counts, especially in the United States, where a couple of, dozen, like, what's it called, like 20,000 votes can decide the election due to gerrymandering. So I think it's key.
Mm-hmm. Maureen? I think your mic.
Thank you. I too agree. I think not in the U.S. national party leaders, they pour dollars into states where, the races for federal offices really determine national power. And I think, locally, sometimes there's a downside of that, because you're not going to be invested in if, the party honchos in the state who control most of the money don't think that a candidate could win there, and therefore it is a waste of resources and money, which drowns out the individual voices of the voters. So locally, campaign finance regulations on the federal level do really have a trickle-down effect on local and county races.
Thank you.
And what is money spent on was one of the previous questions. Well, for instance, also an effort by, I have to say, on the Republican side, who many Republicans still claim that the last election was stolen. So they are funding efforts to fortify the voting infrastructure on every level, from the lowest level of people who count votes up to people who decide. And my fear is that the whole voting apparatus might be corrupted, and that the controversy will not just erupt after the election, like last time, even though behind the scenes it was a fight even before Donald Trump tried to undermine the elections. But I think this may even be happening sort of now. And that's a problem when elections are being sort of corrupted.
Thank you. Here's a question by Martin Richard. How free are candidates in practice to act against the interests of their corporate donors?
I would say not very in the United States. And you see that when candidates on either the extreme left or extreme right will, be primaried by someone more in line, who behaves more in line with the political party platform. Not only are corporations potentially funding their opposition because they are acting to regulate corporations more, perhaps, or they're acting more in the public interest, the political party largely rallies behind that and moves to sort of defeat that candidate. So yes, you are free to act in the way you would like as a campaigner and as a person in office, but it does have implications if you take corporate money, implications on whether you'll be there for the next term and whether you can survive your next campaign.
And I may say that I've been with mega donors firsthand, and I have seen they expect, for instance, their calls to be answered. They have certain very concrete expectations, and you can bet your bottom dollar if those expectations are not fulfilled, they will not finance that candidate anymore.
Oh, I would love to hear more of your stories about mega donors. Maybe you can elaborate on that later. But here's another question to you, Sandra. Do cases like the one of Bistron from the AfD, Voice of Europe, indicate that non-transparent financial transactions are on a rise also in Europe or Germany?
For sure. I'm not in the weeds of this particular case. I read the headlines in some news articles. I think it's it's like with fraud. If you have bad intentions and people are unsuspecting and you're somewhat crafty, it's very difficult to uncover these things. Now, Bistrom was pretty obvious, I feel. It was kind of easy to uncover that. But I look at many politicians in Germany who present seemingly the interests of Russia, who repeat the same talking points. I can only think that they either coincidentally have the same exact ideology, which I doubt. I must suspect that there are financial benefits that they reap. And I asked a couple of people, experts from within the Bundestag, if I'm a member of the Bundestag and they have to disclose all their income that they get in other jobs, side engagements, whatever. And I wanted to kind of channel that through other means so that it doesn't become obvious. All I heard back was if somebody wants to do it, if somebody wants to hide it, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to uncover.
Thank you. Another question by Christian Schütz. How do campaign costs compare between the US and Germany? How much money is typically spent per party or candidate? And who holds the purse strings for a campaign in Germany, the candidate or the party?
I don't have the numbers. I would say they can't compare to the US. They're truly astronomical here. I would think in Germany, the party controls the purse strings. It's much more bureaucratic and kind of, yeah, bureaucratic and democratic.
Maureen, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this question.
Yeah, I don't know specific numbers, but I do know in at least the 2022 midterm election, spending met its projection, which I believe was around $17 billion for all of the federal races. That's a lot of money. And I think probably 200 members were running in that election. So if you just like divide that evenly, it's still shocking per candidate. And I guess, you sort of count their opposition too, but in any event, it's an outrageous amount of money that just seems unreasonable to sort of get from a majority of Americans, which is why, the number has ballooned to be so high. It's corporations spending this money to influence the elections, not individuals. And if it were, the number would be largely much lower.
And there are more and more efforts. I don't know about the legal situation in Germany, but for instance, all the tech titans from Silicon Valley are big time invested in crypto, and they try to get Donald Trump to endorse their crypto efforts because one thing that Donald Trump said, he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve. J.D. Vance said he's against the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world. They want to strengthen crypto. And I believe last I heard Donald Trump had gotten crypto donations in the amount of $4 million, which is very little comparatively. But you see the process, and crypto is, infamous for channeling dark source money. And I think that's a danger. I haven't heard that in Germany just yet, but apparently it's not illegal here.
Mm-hmm. Christian Drasto is asking, are there voices in the US in favor of a more pluralistic party system? I've got the impression that a lot of US citizens are not satisfied with the choice between only two politicians and two poles of political ideas. Okay, this is not concretely raising the question about the financing system, but yeah, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, indirectly, there've always been independent candidates here and there, and they never had a chance. And for instance, in the Democratic Party, there are they have a deep bench of very talented people who could rise up to the top, but they can't because they don't have the money. Some of them perhaps could do a spin out, but they can't because there's no money. So we've seen from experience that, especially the Democratic Party has a very wide spectrum of opinions from very progressive to fairly conservative, what would be the CDU in Germany. And then the Republican Party has completely been hijacked by extremists, and everybody who had a more reasonable stance, like Reagan type conservatives, have either left the party or have been kicked out. So I don't see any chance for anything other than a two-party system. And that's also partially because of party finance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment completely, Sandra. I think even administratively for presidential candidates, if you're a third party candidate, getting on a state ballot is challenging. It's expensive, thanks to a patchwork of laws basically designed by both parties, the dominant parties, to maintain that system in state houses nationwide. So in many cases, outside challengers, they can seek to qualify as independent candidates or candidates from a minor party, though not all states have multiple options. Even more, Democratic and Republican candidates automatically get on ballots in many states, whereas a third party candidate has to jump through a number of administrative hoops. So there's so many disincentives to making a pluralistic system really happen in the US.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions to our audience, and huge thank you to our experts. You covered a lot in this 1 hour, and now I feel we can follow elections in the US and in Germany with a little bit more knowledge, specific knowledge. And I want to thank you, Eva and Victoria, and once again to all our partners for organizing such an insightful discussion, especially in the 2024 US election year. And before I end, I want to invite you all to check out the University of Cologne YouTube channel, where you will find more transatlantic tandem talks. Our event today will be put online soon as well. All right, have a wonderful day in the US or evening in Germany, and hope to see you again next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.